What if one of America's greatest presidents began life with almost nothing? Born in a tiny log cabin, losing his mother at just 9 years old, and facing one setback after another, Abraham Lincoln refused to give up. This is the remarkable true story of the man who led the nation through its darkest chapter and changed American history forever. The story of Abraham Lincoln didn't begin in a grand mansion or a family of privilege. It began in a humble one-room log cabin on the Kentucky frontier. On February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born at Sinking Spring Farm to Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, two hardworking parents striving to build a life in one of America's rugged frontier settlements. Like most frontier families of the early 1800s, the Lincolns lived without electricity or running water. Life demanded constant hard work, and food could be scarce, especially during difficult seasons. Every day required resilience, determination, and hope for a better tomorrow. From an early age, Abraham learned that survival depended on effort. Like many frontier children, he helped with daily chores and family responsibilities. Yet whenever he found a spare moment, he watched the world around him with quiet curiosity, listened carefully, and absorbed every lesson life had to offer. His quiet curiosity and hunger for knowledge were already setting him apart, qualities that would one day shape one of the most influential leaders in American history. No one standing outside that modest Kentucky cabin could have imagined what the future held for the quiet boy growing up inside. Yet history has a remarkable way of finding extraordinary people in the most ordinary places. Before he became America's 16th president, before he preserved the Union, before his name was written into history, Abraham Lincoln was simply a poor frontier boy with an extraordinary future waiting to unfold. For young Abraham Lincoln, childhood was filled with challenges. But the greatest heartbreak came in 1818 when he was just 9 years old. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, became ill with a disease known as milk sickness, a deadly illness that claimed many lives on the American frontier. Despite every effort, she passed away, leaving Abraham and his older sister, Sarah, devastated. The loss changed him forever. Although Lincoln rarely spoke publicly about his grief, those who knew him believed his mother's influence remained with him throughout his life. Her kindness, quiet strength, and values left a lasting impression on the young boy who would one day lead a nation. Without his mother's guidance, life became even more difficult. Formal schooling on the frontier was limited, and Lincoln received less than a year of classroom education in total. Yet his desire to learn never faded. Whenever he could borrow a book, he read it from cover to cover. He often spent hours reading by the light of the fireplace or a candle, exploring history, the Bible, literature, and anything else he could find. Little by little, he educated himself, one page at a time. In the years ahead, that relentless hunger for knowledge would become one of Lincoln's greatest strengths. Long before he entered politics, he was quietly shaping himself into the man history would one day remember. A year after Nancy Lincoln's death, Abraham's father, Thomas Lincoln, remarried. His new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, brought warmth back into the Lincoln household. Sarah quickly recognized Abraham's deep curiosity and encouraged his love of learning. Though the family owned very few books, she encouraged him to read whenever his work was finished. Her support gave Abraham something he desperately needed, someone who believed in his potential. Formal education remained limited. Altogether, Lincoln received less than a year of classroom instruction throughout his childhood, but he refused to let that define his future. Whenever he could borrow a book from a neighbor, he read it from cover to cover. He read the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and Parson Weems' Life of Washington, books that helped shape both his character and his understanding of the world. One well-known story from Lincoln's youth illustrates his character. After borrowing a book from a neighbor, it was accidentally damaged by rain. Rather than making excuses, Abraham admitted what had happened and worked for several days to repay the owner. Whether remembered in every detail or not, the story reflects the reputation for honesty that followed him throughout his life. He was known to read by the light of a fireplace or a candle whenever he had the opportunity, carefully copying passages onto wooden boards, scraps of paper, or anything else he could find. When the space was full, he simply erased it and began again. For Abraham Lincoln, education was never something that happened only in a classroom. It was a lifelong pursuit driven by discipline, curiosity, and determination. Long before he became a lawyer, a president, or one of the most influential figures in American history, Abraham Lincoln had already mastered one of life's greatest lessons: the ability to teach himself. As Abraham Lincoln grew into adulthood, his reputation began to spread, not because of wealth or social status, but because people trusted him. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, Lincoln worked at a variety of jobs. He split rails, farmed, ferried passengers across rivers, and later found work as a store clerk in the small village of New Salem, Illinois. Whatever the task, he approached it with quiet determination and a strong sense of responsibility. Customers soon noticed something unusual about the young clerk. If he made a mistake while counting change or measuring goods, he would go out of his way to correct it, even if it meant walking miles to return a few cents or a small purchase. Stories like these, passed down over the years, helped build the image of a man whose honesty was beyond question. Whether every detail can be verified today or not, there is little doubt that Lincoln earned the respect of those around him. His integrity, fairness, and willingness to admit his mistakes became defining qualities of his character. In New Salem, people came to see Abraham Lincoln as someone they could rely on. Long before he held public office, he had already discovered something more valuable than success: the trust of his community. By 1832, Abraham Lincoln had earned the respect of many people in New Salem. Encouraged by friends and neighbors, the 23-year-old decided to run for the Illinois General Assembly. It was a bold decision for a young man with little formal education, no wealth, and few political connections. In his first campaign, Lincoln spoke about improving roads, expanding education, and making transportation along the Sangamon River more reliable. He believed that better infrastructure would create opportunities for ordinary families and help communities grow. But before the election took place, the Black Hawk War broke out. Lincoln volunteered for military service and was elected captain of his local militia, a role he later described as one of the honors he valued most. Although he never fought in a major battle, the experience strengthened his leadership and earned him even greater respect among his peers. When the election results were announced, Lincoln was defeated. For many young politicians, such a loss might have marked the end of their ambitions. But Lincoln saw it differently. Defeat was not a reason to quit. It was a lesson to learn from. His first campaign ended in disappointment, but it revealed something even more important: the courage to step forward, the humility to accept defeat, and the determination to try again. Those qualities would shape every chapter of his remarkable life. Defeat in the 1832 election did not discourage Abraham Lincoln. Instead, it strengthened his determination. He believed that lasting success was earned through patience, hard work, and a willingness to learn from failure. After the election, Lincoln returned to New Salem and continued building his future. He worked as a postmaster, served as a deputy county surveyor, and spent countless hours studying law on his own. Every new responsibility became another opportunity to grow. Life, however, was far from easy. His small business partnership eventually failed, leaving him with significant debts. Rather than walking away, Lincoln accepted full responsibility. Over many years, he repaid every dollar he owed, a burden he jokingly referred to as his national debt. His determination to honor his commitments earned him even greater respect. In 1834, Lincoln ran for the Illinois General Assembly once again. This time, the people who had watched his honesty, perseverance, and character chose to place their trust in him. He won the election and began his first term as a state legislator. Lincoln's journey proved that failure is rarely the end of the story. Sometimes, it is simply the beginning of a stronger, wiser, and more determined version of ourselves. Serving in the Illinois General Assembly gave Abraham Lincoln a deeper understanding of government and the law. The more he studied public affairs, the more he realized that the law could be a powerful tool for justice and opportunity. Without attending a formal law school, Lincoln began studying on his own. He borrowed legal books whenever he could, reading them late into the night with remarkable discipline. Page by page, he taught himself the principles of law, relying on determination rather than privilege. In 1836, after years of independent study, Lincoln qualified for the Illinois bar and was licensed to practice law. It was an extraordinary achievement for a man who had received less than a year of formal education. The following year, he moved to Springfield, Illinois, the state's new capital, to begin his legal career. There, he joined the law practice of John T. Stewart, an experienced attorney who had recognized Lincoln's intelligence and potential years earlier. In court, Lincoln quickly earned a reputation for careful preparation, clear reasoning, and unwavering honesty. He preferred facts over drama and fairness over personal gain. If he believed a client was in the wrong, he was known to discourage unnecessary lawsuits rather than pursue them for profit. For Abraham Lincoln, the law was more than a profession. It was a way to serve others, uphold justice, and build the character that would one day prepare him for even greater responsibilities. As Abraham Lincoln's career continued to grow, so did the complexities of his personal life. While living in New Salem, Lincoln became close to Anne Rutledge, a young woman remembered for her kindness and intelligence. Some historians believe a deep romantic relationship developed between them, while others argue that the evidence remains uncertain. Whatever the nature of their bond, Anne's death in 1835 deeply affected Lincoln and marked one of the most difficult periods of his life. Years later, after moving to Springfield, Lincoln met Mary Todd, an educated and politically interested woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Intelligent, confident, and quick-witted, Mary shared Lincoln's fascination with politics and public affairs. Their relationship was far from simple. They experienced periods of doubt, a broken engagement, and personal uncertainty before finally marrying on November 4th, 1842. Together, they would build a family and face both moments of happiness and heartbreaking loss. Mary's unwavering belief in Lincoln's abilities often encouraged him to pursue ambitions that many others considered impossible. Behind the public life of Abraham Lincoln stood a deeply personal story, one shaped by love, loss, resilience, and the people who believed in him when the future was still uncertain. By the 1850s, the United States was becoming increasingly divided over one issue that seemed impossible to ignore: slavery. For decades, the nation had struggled to balance the interests of free states and slave states. As the country expanded westward, a difficult question followed every new territory. Would slavery be allowed to spread, or would it be restricted? Abraham Lincoln watched these debates with growing concern. Although he did not begin his political career as an abolitionist, he believed slavery was morally wrong and opposed its expansion into the Western territories. He feared that allowing it to spread would threaten the principles on which the nation had been founded. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 transformed the political landscape. By allowing settlers to decide for themselves whether slavery would be permitted, the law reignited a national conflict that many had hoped was settled. To Lincoln, it marked a turning point. After several years away from national politics, he returned to public life with renewed purpose. His speeches became more thoughtful, more persuasive, and increasingly focused on preserving the nation's founding ideals while confronting the growing crisis over slavery. The debate was no longer just about politics. It had become a question of a nation's identity, its future, and whether the promise of liberty could truly belong to all. By 1858, Abraham Lincoln had become one of the leading voices opposing the expansion of slavery. That year, he challenged Stephen A. Douglas, one of the nation's most influential politicians, for a seat in the United States Senate. The campaign quickly became far more than a state election. Over the course of 7 debates held across Illinois, Lincoln and Douglas presented 2 competing visions for the nation's future. Large crowds gathered to hear them speak, while newspapers carried their arguments to readers across the country. Douglas defended the principle of popular sovereignty, arguing that settlers in each territory should decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Lincoln, while acknowledging the limits of federal authority where slavery already existed, argued that it should not be allowed to expand into the Western territories. He believed the nation could not remain permanently divided between freedom and slavery. Earlier that year, Lincoln had delivered what became known as his House-divided speech, declaring, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He warned that the United States could not endure indefinitely as a nation half slave and half free. The speech was controversial, but it clearly expressed the growing crisis facing the country. When the election ended, Douglas retained his Senate seat. Lincoln had lost once again, yet this defeat was different. His calm reasoning, moral conviction, and remarkable skill as a speaker had attracted national attention. Americans far beyond Illinois now knew his name. The debates did not make Abraham Lincoln a senator. They made him a national leader and quietly opened the path that would soon lead to the presidency. The Lincoln-Douglas debates had introduced Abraham Lincoln to the nation. Although he had lost the Senate race, his speeches and character had earned the respect of people far beyond Illinois. By 1860, the United States stood at a crossroads. Tensions over slavery had deepened, political parties were divided, and many Americans feared that the nation itself was beginning to fracture. That year, the newly formed Republican Party nominated Lincoln as its candidate for president. Compared with many of his rivals, he had limited national political experience. Yet his reputation for honesty, moderation, and thoughtful leadership appealed to voters seeking stability during a time of growing uncertainty. The presidential election of 1860 was one of the most consequential in American history. With the Democratic Party split between Northern and Southern candidates, Lincoln won the presidency with a majority of the Electoral College, although he received less than 40% of the nationwide popular vote. His victory was celebrated across much of the North, but in several Southern states, it was viewed with deep alarm. Even before Lincoln took office, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. In the weeks that followed, 6 more Southern states declared secession and formed the Confederate States of America. When Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C., to take the presidential oath on March 4th, 1861, he inherited a nation on the brink of civil war. The challenges before him were unlike any faced by an American president before. The election had ended, but Lincoln's greatest test was only beginning. The fate of the Union and the future of the United States would soon rest upon his leadership. Just over a month after Abraham Lincoln took office, the nation's deepest fears became reality. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a U.S. military fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. After 34 hours of bombardment, the fort surrendered. The American Civil War had begun. Lincoln faced an extraordinary challenge. His first priority was preserving the Union. In response to the attack, he called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the nation and restore federal authority. The decision inspired thousands to enlist, but it also pushed several more Southern states to join the Confederacy. As the conflict spread, families, friends, and entire communities found themselves divided. Brothers fought on opposite sides, and a war many believed would last only a few weeks soon became a long and devastating struggle. Throughout the crisis, Lincoln remained determined to keep the Union together. He understood that military victory alone would not be enough. The nation would also need hope, unity, and steady leadership through its darkest days. The months that followed brought painful defeats as well as hard-earned victories. With every decision, Lincoln carried the weight of a nation whose future was uncertain. The Civil War had begun as a battle to preserve the Union. Before it was over, it would also redefine the meaning of freedom in the United States. As the Civil War continued, Abraham Lincoln came to believe that preserving the Union and confronting slavery could no longer be separated. For much of his presidency, his primary goal had been to save the Union. But as the war grew longer and more devastating, Lincoln concluded that ending slavery in the rebelling states had become both a military necessity and a moral imperative. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The order declared that enslaved people in areas still under Confederate control shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Although it did not immediately free every enslaved person in the United States, it fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. The proclamation also opened the door for thousands of African American men to serve in the Union Army and Navy. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers had joined the Union forces, making a vital contribution to the nation's fight for survival. Lincoln understood that the proclamation alone would not end slavery everywhere. Lasting change required a constitutional amendment. He therefore threw his support behind what would become the 13th Amendment, which would permanently abolish slavery throughout the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation did more than reshape a war. It reshaped the nation's moral purpose and brought the United States one step closer to the promise that all people are born equal. By the autumn of 1863, the Civil War had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. One of its bloodiest battles had taken place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where Union forces had turned back a Confederate invasion. On November 19, 1863, a ceremony was held to dedicate the new Soldiers' National Cemetery. The day's principal speaker was the renowned orator Edward Everett, who delivered a speech lasting nearly 2 hours. President Abraham Lincoln was invited to offer only a few closing remarks. Lincoln spoke for just about 2 minutes. In fewer than 272 words, he reminded the nation that the United States had been founded on the principle that all men are created equal. He honored those who had given their lives and challenged the living to continue the unfinished work for which they had sacrificed so much. He concluded with words that would become some of the most famous in American history: that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. At the time, some newspapers praised the speech while others criticized it. But as the years passed, the Gettysburg Address came to be recognized as one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in the English language. In just 2 minutes, Abraham Lincoln gave the nation more than a speech. He gave it a renewed purpose, one rooted in liberty, equality, and the enduring promise of democracy. By 1864, the Civil War had entered its 4th year. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and both the Union and the Confederacy were exhausted. Many Americans questioned whether the war would ever end. Despite mounting criticism, President Abraham Lincoln remained determined to preserve the Union. He placed his confidence in General Ulysses S. Grant, appointing him commander of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was relentless. While Union forces advanced on multiple fronts, General William Tecumseh Sherman led a campaign through the South that weakened the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. Even in the midst of conflict, Lincoln faced another challenge: the presidential election of 1864. With the war still raging, many believed he would lose. But a series of important Union victories, including the capture of Atlanta, strengthened public confidence in his leadership. Lincoln was re-elected, ensuring that the war would continue until the Union was restored. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy could no longer sustain the fight. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Although a few Confederate forces remained in the field for a short time, Lee's surrender effectively marked the end of the Civil War. For Lincoln, victory was not a moment for revenge. He urged the nation to heal its divisions and rebuild with compassion. In his second inaugural address, he called for reconciliation, with malice toward none, with charity for all. The Union had been preserved. Slavery was coming to an end. But Lincoln believed that the nation's greatest challenge was no longer winning the war, it was winning the peace. By the spring of 1865, the Civil War was drawing to a close. After 4 years of unimaginable sacrifice, the Union had been preserved, and the nation was beginning to look toward peace. Although victory had been achieved, Abraham Lincoln knew that rebuilding the country would be an even greater challenge. He hoped to reunite a deeply divided nation with compassion rather than vengeance. His vision was one of reconciliation, healing, and a lasting peace. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, President Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln at close range. The president was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where doctors remained by his side throughout the night. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died at the age of 56. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton is widely reported to have said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Whether remembered exactly as spoken or in slightly different words, the statement captured the profound sense of loss felt across the nation. Millions of Americans mourned the president who had guided the country through its darkest crisis. His funeral train traveled through several states, allowing countless citizens to pay their final respects before he was laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln did not live to see the nation fully rebuilt, but the principles he defended, union, liberty, and equality, would continue to shape the United States for generations to come. The news of Abraham Lincoln's death spread across the nation with astonishing speed. Church bells rang in cities and small towns alike. Businesses closed their doors, and millions of Americans struggled to comprehend the loss of the president who had guided the country through its greatest crisis. The attack was not an isolated act. John Wilkes Booth had been part of a wider conspiracy aimed at disrupting the United States government. On the same night, other conspirators targeted Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward was seriously wounded but survived, while the planned attack on Johnson was never carried out. Booth fled Washington immediately after the assassination. For 12 days, Union soldiers and detectives searched across southern Maryland and Virginia. On April 26, 1865, Booth was found hiding in a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. After refusing to surrender, he was shot during the confrontation and died a few hours later. Meanwhile, the nation mourned. Lincoln's funeral train traveled nearly 1,700 miles, retracing much of the route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. In city after city, thousands stood silently along the tracks, paying their final respects. The assassination shocked not only the United States, but also much of the world. Messages of sympathy arrived from foreign governments, recognizing Lincoln as a leader who had guided his nation through one of the greatest crises of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln's life had ended, but his influence had not. His death transformed him from a wartime president into a lasting symbol of unity, freedom, and democratic leadership. Abraham Lincoln's life was a remarkable journey of perseverance, humility, and purpose. He was born in a humble one-room log cabin on the Kentucky frontier, received less than a year of formal education, and taught himself through determination and an unrelenting desire to learn. Step by step, he rose from poverty to become the 16th President of the United States. During the nation's greatest crisis, Lincoln preserved the Union, guided the country through the Civil War, and helped set the United States on the path toward the abolition of slavery. His leadership was marked not only by courage, but also by humility, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to democratic government. His influence did not end with his presidency. The ideals he defended, liberty, equality, and government accountable to its people, continue to shape the United States and inspire people around the world. Abraham Lincoln was born in a humble log cabin and died as the leader who preserved the Union through its greatest trial. His life proved that determination, integrity, and compassion could shape the course of a nation. More than a century later, his words and example continue to inspire people around the world. His story is not only the story of one president. It is the story of a nation tested by division, and of a leader who believed that freedom, unity, and democracy were worth every sacrifice. History remembers Abraham Lincoln not because he lived an easy life, but because he met extraordinary challenges with extraordinary character. Generations of Americans have looked to Lincoln as a symbol of integrity, perseverance, and democratic leadership. His words continue to be studied in classrooms, quoted by presidents, and remembered during moments of national reflection. In 1922, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Today, millions of visitors stand before its towering marble statue each year. Inscribed on its walls are the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, enduring reminders of a leader who believed that a divided nation could be reunited through justice, compassion, and the rule of law. Lincoln's influence extends far beyond the United States. Historians around the world continue to study his leadership during one of the greatest constitutional and moral crises of the 19th century. His example demonstrates that true leadership is measured not by power or privilege, but by the courage to make difficult decisions for the greater good. More than 2 centuries after his birth, Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most admired figures in American history. His legacy lives not only in monuments and history books, but also in the enduring ideals of democracy, equality, and freedom that continue to inspire people across the world. From a one-room log cabin to the White House, Abraham Lincoln's journey reminds us that greatness is not determined by where we begin, but by the choices we make, the principles we defend, and the lives we touch. His story did not end on April 15, 1865. It lives on wherever people believe that courage can overcome hardship, that truth is stronger than fear, and that freedom is worth defending. Abraham Lincoln made his choice. He chose courage over comfort. He chose unity over division. He chose hope over fear. He did not seek greatness for himself. He sought to do what was right. And in doing so, he helped shape the future of the United States and influenced the course of history.